here we are on Friday, and what we typically have done in terms of the curriculum is we've always started with the national scene. We've all tried to go more deeply into one or two themes. So we've been into a teacher evaluation at a new depth. We've added another possible multiple measure with the student data out of the Tripod project. We are trying to enrich all of those pieces with kind of new combinations and so forth. What we typically do as our last exercise, in addition to allowing plenty of team time, we basically try to do some sort of open group session in which we basically listen to the themes and try and allow ourselves to basically move out ahead of our typical curriculum and our process to see what it is that is of really difficult dimension coming at us, and whether we have any experience at all in the several states with respect to that. And here is, in some senses at least, you'll see later this afternoon, and some attempt to think about some of those tougher issues and have some new conversations that may lead us into new content in the curriculum. The first one is, in some senses, to continue to go deeper and broader. That is to say, do we have additional multiple measures that we have missed here? That issue of input should not be, in some senses, totally walked away from. And if you look at where the nation is going, all right, the nation is driving this teacher evaluation piece very, very quickly. You can hear it in the agenda of the Office of Education. You can hear it in some early research projects. Vark could share a little bit. Chris Thorne could share a little bit about where this thing is going, but it is crystal clear that it is moving from student data back through classroom, back through district, back through state. And where this is going, and it is going very, very fast with some early research and some language around accountability, is it is going to move deeply into the teacher training institutions. Because more and more there is language of policy that says the issue is recruitment, the issue is training, and so forth and so on. So one basically is going to find this movement, we think, coming back further and further upstream, if you will, to sources. Who goes into this profession? Why do they stay? Or don't? Why do they not stay? What do the most successful training approaches look like? And in some senses, what do the least successful ones look like? The accountability piece is not going to stop here. It's going to basically move back very quickly. All right? So in some senses, we would like a group perhaps, or at least suggest that one ought to basically look at some of that early movement and how people are sorting that out. The second piece is, in some senses, even more difficult for us to look at. And that is to say that because we have used this model for so long, and because we have negotiated contract language at this level of the district, the local, in some senses, and we negotiate, of course, here for all of the sites. Whether there are 5 sites or 50 sites, we negotiate work rules, compensation, and so forth, and so on. And the difficulty that that has led us to is that in some senses, as we have held, if you will, that enterprise, that structure, all right, and so forth, as a key hook for the union, the world has moved to school site. It is moved there with respect to the focus. It's moved there with respect to, in some senses, the focus of parents and children. Right? It is moved there with the SIG grants. All of the focus has, in some senses, come to the school. The charter elements, Milwaukee is here in the room with the greatest experience in the country around even further kinds of vouchers that in many ways take tens of thousands of students out of Milwaukee every year with public dollars, all right, into tiny religious and other kinds of entities called schools, right, in Milwaukee. with a huge loss of resources and so forth and so on. And the reason is that it looks like this thing is frozen. And it is frozen so that all work rules make all the schools, if you will, the same. And it basically precludes us from looking at choice within, not without, and what we might have to do. And when the debate opens up, it opens up fairly narrowly, all right? With, in some senses, 45 minutes of extended time. That's not the issue. The issue is different learners and different parents with different goals. Yes, the goal of being college ready and so forth. But the requirements and at least the desires to have different places for their children. If we continue to stand for no difference in here, we in some senses are looking at a very, very difficult place to end up. Meanwhile, of course, we negotiate, all right, a common contract, and we write literally, in some cases in the room that I won't mention, thousands of MOUs, all right, that gives us the freedom to then redesign at the site level. So we write it here and freeze it, and then undo it by the tens of thousands in terms of exceptions. That's not exactly, in some senses, either an efficient or a thought-out strategic strategy with respect to. It is not about work rules. It's about choice for children. It's about delivery of different approaches to pedagogy and so forth and so on. We are not playing with our heads up here, all right? We have confused, probably, all right, equality with sameness. And we, in some senses, have to deconstruct that in such a way that we can play in a new world. This is going to be a hard set of discussions. Already is. This piece of compensation, again, gets framed in strange ways. Michigan is here right now with a piece of state legislation that requires some sort of merit pay or examination of it and so forth. That's not the issue. Again, this is an issue of sameness versus equality. The real issues here are about fivefold, and we need a place to start talking about them. The first issue is, all right, sameness of pay for unequal results. Tough issue for us as a union to look at. All right. The second issue is, in some senses, whether we believe at all that this profession allows for some sort of use of compensation, if you will, for motivation. I think that cuts at the core of a moral enterprise. That would be like paying doctors and nurses more for more successful kinds of delivery. Is it, in some senses, because it is clearly for us not a motivational issue? What about the issue of reward that I begged up here in the first category? What about the issue of market? Right? That the Secretary of Education has called into question from the very beginning, even in his years and days in Chicago. If a physics teacher with 10 or 20 years of experience and a good sound degree in the marketplace is worth $20,000 to $30,000 more than a third-grade teacher, what do we do about that? Do we have any kind of response that is powerful and thoughtful? Do we have any way to work with that? And finally, we've already well left the barn with respect to, if you will, let's call it hardship pay. There are plenty of places in the country where we have bargained, if you will, pay for individuals and teams to go in for 2 or 3 years into difficult places to teach for a period of time. Because of the degree of difficulty, we are in some senses able somehow to justify walking away from the sameness issue there, and not confusing it with equality, because of the difference in the work challenge, if you will. All I'm really trying to say is, as I look at this is not a question of compensation. This is an enormously complex way to ask the question of sameness of pay, and for what? And we must, in some senses, get into this, wrestle with it, or, in the case of one state after another, having this, in some senses, naively and inappropriately jammed down our throats. And the last piece is we have enormous learning in the room, I think, already, around what costs we're really talking about here with respect to, in some senses, making these transitions at all. We know that the SIG grants, for instance, provide X amount of dollars for deep reflective time. We know that if we're going to build deep learning organizations, we have to have 2 or 3 hours a week of reflective time based on best practice, each other's student work in comparison, watching each other teach, looking at good data, and so forth. Do we know the real cost of that, number one? We also know that, and we have some of the best examples in the country, from Fran and Toledo all the way across, the use of teachers as reviewers, as enhancers, as fellow teachers in some sort of PAR program. Do we know not just the cost of that for the first 2 or 3 years, but do we know, have we thought about the cost and the resources required to basically begin some sort of ongoing every 2 to 3 year teacher evaluation, growth and professional development? Hillsborough may be able to help us look at that information very closely. Do we know the cost of the training there and the set-aside, if you will, of human resources that's required to make this a deep learning, reflective organization? So the training piece, all right, and the deep use of it. The last piece is, in some senses, even if we, in some senses, have some chances to look across the country at places where every 2 to 3 years this gets done. All right. Joe and I have had some discussions, and several other people in this room, around the fact that how many times a year must you be observed in your observation year for this to be valid feedback data? All right. 5, perhaps, 50-minute segments, which has an enormous cost to us, but probably the only validity. And perhaps 2 of those being summative, maybe done by administration, and 3 of them being much more formative, done by some sort of peer selection process in which a cadre of coaches, well-trained, in some senses, represent the pool. At any rate, the question of who's doing the best training, what does it look like, what does it cost, and what's it going to take for us to get to high quality there, all of that, in some senses, underpins how well we do this teacher evaluation in the long run. So, those are at least 4 major areas that we thought we would form some focus groups around. We will have some opportunities through Louise and Mary to perhaps add 1 or 2 others, and then as usual we will form ourselves with someone to take a few notes so that we can all hear what those discussions look like as our last exercise of the day. So again, I'm sorry I've not been able to be with you, and I think we in some senses have a very powerful and robust, as you've heard the last 2 days, robust kind of initiative beginning across the country, region by region, and certainly Great Lakes is leading the way with respect to its strength, its breadth, and now with growing depth as well. And it's fun to be with it, it's fun to have you here, and we would encourage you to continue to bring, first of all, your administration and your community members, and second, to reach out to other locals. It's wonderful to have Michigan here now. It's nice to have Wisconsin back at the table, and we will continue to hopefully provide some good, solid, deep work, a good place to have the right